Hi, my name is Michael Seiler, and I'm here to share with you the results of a study that's titled The Role of Informational Uncertainty in the Decision to Strategically Default. So let me start by defining what it means to economically versus strategically default. An economic default occurs when you stop paying your mortgage, but you really have no choice. You don't have the economic means to keep making your payments. A strategic default is when you, by choice, stop making your mortgage payments. So you can afford to continue to make them, but for whatever reason, economic, behavioral, you decide that you're not going to do it anymore. I like to borrow concepts from other fields that have long been understood and apply them to real estate. And that gives us additional insight into a concept that we haven't had before. And here's the idea behind this. If you look in the law journals, you'll read about a concept called the theory of incomplete contracts. And here's what it means. If you write a contract where you say exactly what's going to happen in the event of a breach of contract, then people are going to view that more as just a legal document. It's going to take the immorality out of it. But if instead you just conceptually describe what the relationships are and the expectations are, well, that's an incomplete contract. We don't know exactly what's going to happen if you breach the contract. And what they find in the law field is that if you have an incomplete contract, then people are going to rely more on the social norms of the day. They're going to think in terms of, well, what's the moral standard of this? How do people generally view this? And that is what's going to help the courts decide how they're going to rule on this decision. Now, as a quick example, all of us understand already the concept of complete versus incomplete contracts. Let's take your phone, for example. So you have a phone contract with, let's say, Verizon. And in that contract, they have a very standard thing that you sign. Maybe you've read it, maybe you haven't. But they say if you're going to sign a 2-year contract and you decide for any reason to get out of that contract, then you pay a forfeiture fee. Let's just say it's $150. And that buys you out of your contract. And then you go your separate way. You're happy to get a different phone, different provider, different whatever. So if I were to ask people, is that immoral for you to breach your phone contract? Most people would say, no, it's no big deal. They just said I pay $150. That's a financial decision. There's nothing immoral about it. It's just a straight economic decision. Now, if I were to ask you the same question about paying your mortgage and not paying your mortgage, most people are going to say that that's an immoral activity. We've done a number of studies on this, and we found that people view defaulting on a mortgage as being extremely immoral. Even those who actually default on the mortgage agree that it's immoral. So there's really little debate on this, empirically speaking. So then I start asking the question, well, in a mortgage contract, they also are quite specific and quite complete in what is going to happen if you breach, if you default on your mortgage. They're very specific about that. So how does this idea of an incomplete contract relate to mortgages? And here's my concept, here's my idea. We understand what on paper will happen to you if you breach your mortgage contract. But that's not what happens most of the time in reality. It's a best kept industry secret that most of the time the lenders are not going to come after you. Now, the big banks, they tend not to come after you. The smaller, like the credit unions, they actually tend to come after you more often. But as a general rule, the fear of financial backlash that you think is coming tends not to come. And if it does come, it tends to come many, many years later, where you get to live in the house effectively rent or mortgage free for a number of years, depending on what state that you're in. So there seems to be a disconnect. Although it technically is a complete contract, it acts as an incomplete contract. So I want to use this theory of incomplete contracts to try to explain what would be a better activity for a lender. Does it make sense to truly spell out, maybe even as a government policy, what's going to happen to you and what's not going to happen to you? Even though we've tested this idea in other places, in this study we retest the idea and we say, if you default on your mortgage, what do you think the likelihood is, the probability that your lender is going to come after you? And do you know that the most popular answer is 100%? The median is around 70%. But most people, what we call the mode, or the most frequently answered number, is 100%. So that means the majority of people are thoroughly convinced that their lender is going to come after them, and that's just simply not the way it works. So in this concept of incomplete contracts, the question becomes, As a lender, what do you put forward? As a government agency, what do you put forward? Well, the one thing that we know they need to put forward is to keep that fear alive that you will have your feet held to the fire if you strategically default or default by any means. You need to believe that the lender is going to come after you, because that single-handedly is holding a lot of people back. We'd have a huge wave of defaults if people knew the truth about that. So by all means, policy-wise, keep that up. Now, the other thing that we look at in terms of incomplete contracts is, how do we really market this? If it is in fact an incomplete contract, and if the social norms are going to rule, and right now the social norm is that it's immoral to do this. Well, our other studies have shown that over time, as more and more people strategically default, it takes away that negative stigma. People are more willing to strategically default the more socially normal it becomes. So as more and more people strategically default, the social norm will be that it's not that big a deal. And in terms of prosecuting these, because right now we have judges that go all kinds of different ways. Some people say, well, the lender had bad paperwork, and yeah, you didn't pay, but do you really have a solid contract here anyway? So if that social norm continues to go to the point where there's no stigma attached to strategically defaulting, then it's entirely plausible that judges are going to view this as an incomplete contract and rely on the social norm, which means that people are more likely to get away with it. If they're more likely to get away with it, they're more likely to do it. And again, you can have this downward spiral, or this contagion that we talk about in a lot of our other papers. So that's the general idea of this study. If you'd like to know more, please go to our website. Thank you.